The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. This is a modern retelling of one of Stoker's best-known ghost stories, centered on a man staying in a haunted house where the malevolent spirit of a judge terrorizes him. While the language has been updated for today's audience, the story stays faithful to Stoker's original vision and eerie atmosphere. Rewritten by Raymond Davey, spoken by Christine Fletcher. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss out on any new stories, whether they're reimagined fairy tales, classic plays, or timeless legends, and it helps support more content like this. Now, sit back, relax, and join me as our story begins. Chapter 1: Arrival at Benchurch. The day Malcolm arrived at Benchurch, the sky hung low with an oppressive heaviness, casting a gray pall over the landscape. The town, barely more than a few narrow streets huddled together, seemed forgotten by time. It was a place that had long since resigned itself to its own insignificance, tucked away in the shadow of larger cities, and that was exactly what Malcolm had been looking for. He stepped off the train and onto the quiet, nearly deserted platform. 3 hours of monotonous travel had brought him here, and he could already feel the welcome quiet of the town beginning to settle into his bones. The only sound that met his ears was the distant rustle of wind through trees, and he felt an odd satisfaction. There would be no distractions here, no friends, no noise, no temptations to draw him away from his studies. Perfect solitude, exactly what he needed. His portmanteau was light, carrying only a few changes of clothes and a carefully chosen selection of his academic materials. As he lifted it off the platform, he allowed himself a rare smile. The final exam was looming, and he had been slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations back at the university. They had grown like weeds around him, wrapping themselves around every moment of his life. Here, in this small, forgotten town, those tendrils of obligation would loosen. He would have space to think, to focus, to breathe. The town itself seemed content to offer him that space. As he made his way down the cobbled road toward the inn, few people passed by. Those that did offered no more than a cursory glance before hurrying on, shoulders hunched against the wind. The place had the air of a town that moved slowly, without urgency or ambition. Even the buildings seemed half asleep, worn down by years of neglect. Malcolm liked that. It meant no one would bother him. He reached the inn, a small building that looked as though it had once been cheerful but had since faded, just like everything else in Benchurch. A faded sign above the door read, "The Good Traveler." Inside, a fire crackled lazily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The innkeeper, Mrs. Witham, a middle-aged woman with a round face, greeted him kindly enough, though there was something guarded in her manner. She handed him the key to his room without asking too many questions, which Malcolm appreciated. He hadn't come here to socialize. He had come to escape the noise and distraction of the world, and the sleepy little inn was exactly what he had expected. The room was small, with a low ceiling and a single window looking out over the town. It would serve his needs for now, but already he felt the restlessness creeping in. It wasn't the quiet he had hoped for, not really. The inn was too close to the center of town, too connected to the faint pulse of human life. He needed something more isolated. The following morning, after a night of uneasy sleep, Malcolm set out to explore the town, hoping to find a more suitable place to stay. His steps led him through the narrow streets until he reached the outskirts, where the buildings became sparse and the land stretched out into desolate fields. That was when he saw it. The house. It loomed at the end of the road, standing apart from the town like a sentinel. The structure was massive, heavy with age and neglect, its dark stone walls covered in ivy, its high gables cut into the sky, and its small, narrow windows, placed oddly high on the walls, stared out like the eyes of some long-forgotten sentinel. The house exuded a kind of quiet menace, as if it had been waiting for years, untouched by time, untouched by life. Malcolm paused at the sight of it. Something about the house drew him in. It was exactly the kind of place he had been looking for, isolated, quiet, and above all, empty. There was no sign of life, no movement behind the windows, no smoke from the chimneys. It was as if the house had been abandoned for decades. From the post office, he inquired about the house and learned it was known as the Judge's House. The name meant nothing to Malcolm, though it clearly stirred some unease in the old postmaster, who had been reluctant to talk about it at all. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and the locals avoided it, though they would not say why. This only intrigued Malcolm further. A house avoided by superstitious villagers was perfect. It meant no one would disturb him. He was sure that with a little effort, he could make the place livable enough for his needs. He wasted no time finding the lawyer who held the keys to the house. Mr. Carnford, a portly, affable man with thinning hair, had seemed almost relieved when Malcolm expressed interest in the property. "To tell you the truth," Carnford had said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I'm glad someone's willing to stay there. The house has been empty for far too long. I'd rent it to you for next to nothing, if only to put the villagers' minds at ease. They've grown ridiculous about it, you see. Absurd rumors." Malcolm had nodded politely, but wasn't interested in the details. He had no use for the nonsense of rural townsfolk. All that mattered was that the house would be his, at least for the next few months. He signed the lease on the spot, pocketed the keys, and left with a growing sense of anticipation. His next stop was the inn, where Mrs. Witham looked shocked when he told her his plans. Her pale face grew even paler as he explained he would be moving to the Judge's house. "Not there, sir," she had exclaimed, nearly dropping the plate she was holding. "You can't mean the Judge's house. No one stays there, not for long." When Malcolm pressed her for details, she had only vague answers. Something about a judge who had lived there long ago, known for his cruelty. The stories were old, she said, handed down through generations, and no one quite remembered why the house had been abandoned. But everyone knew it wasn't a place to live. Malcolm dismissed her concerns with a smile and a gentle word of thanks. Superstitions of this sort were common in places like Benchurch, and he had no patience for them. What mattered was that the house was quiet and that he would be able to focus on his studies without interruption. That afternoon, he walked back to the Judge's house with the keys in his pocket. As he stood before the imposing front door, he felt a strange thrill of excitement. The house was his, and with it, the peace and solitude he craved. But as he turned the key in the lock and pushed open the heavy door, a gust of cold air swept past him, as though the house itself were exhaling after years of stillness. He stepped inside, and the door creaked shut behind him. The house was silent, too silent. Malcolm stood in the darkened hallway, staring at the shadowed staircases and the vast, empty rooms beyond. It was exactly what he had wanted, wasn't it? A strange unease settled over him, but he pushed it aside. He was here to work, not to entertain silly thoughts. He would make the house his own, and within these walls he would master his studies. For now the house waited, silent and patient. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The House Settles. The first thing Malcolm noticed was the smell, stale and musty, as though the house had long since forgotten the scent of human life. The air was thick with dust, and it clung to his clothes as he walked through the main hall, trailing his fingers along the dark wood of the walls. His footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness of the space, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to reverberate in the silence. He had brought no more than a few bags with him, his books, a few personal belongings, and a change of clothes. The agent had assured him that the house was furnished, though sparsely. As he moved further into the dim interior, he saw that it was true. A great oak dining table dominated the main room, its surface worn smooth with age. Several chairs, ancient and high-backed, were pushed against it, as if the room had been hastily abandoned in the middle of a meal. The fireplace, massive and carved with intricate details, sat cold and empty. Its hearth was choked with ashes, as though the last fire had died out long ago and been forgotten. Despite its size, the house was almost unnervingly dark. The small windows, set unusually high, allowed little light to filter in. What did manage to find its way through was thin and gray, casting long shadows across the floor. The atmosphere felt thick and oppressive, but Malcolm found it strangely compelling. This was exactly what he needed, a place cut off from the world. Here, no one could bother him, no one could intrude on his thoughts. The isolation was perfect. If anything, the weight of the silence would help him focus, would push him deeper into his studies. The rooms were vast and empty, the air still, and the house seemed to absorb sound like a sponge. It was as though the world beyond its walls did not exist at all. As he moved upstairs to the bedrooms, the staircase groaned under his weight. Each step felt as though it might collapse beneath him, but it held. The house had the appearance of having been left in a hurry, yet despite the neglect, the structure was sturdy. Dust gathered in thick layers on every surface, and cobwebs filled the corners of the high ceilings, but the furniture, though ancient, was intact. He chose the largest of the bedrooms at the front of the house. A large four-poster bed, draped in faded velvet curtains, dominated the room. The mattress looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, but it would do. He was not here for luxury. A simple bed, a chair, and a small table for his books. That was all he required. By the time he finished unpacking, the sun had begun to set, casting a dull orange glow through the few windows that faced west. He stood at the window, looking out over the desolate landscape that stretched beyond the house. The town of Benchurch lay in the distance, a few chimney tops barely visible through the haze. The silence was complete. Malcolm turned away from the window and made his way back downstairs, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the hallway. He felt an odd sense of satisfaction. The house, in all its emptiness and isolation, felt like a challenge, a place that would test his resolve, force him to concentrate. It was as though the very walls dared him to stay. He lit the fire in the dining room and set to work unpacking his books. The flames crackled and snapped, casting flickering shadows across the room, but they did little to warm the chill that had settled in his bones. He pulled his chair closer to the hearth, arranging his papers on the table in neat piles, and settled into his work. For hours, Malcolm pored over his notes, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the vast silence. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the shutters against the windows. He barely noticed. His mind was consumed by his studies, lost in the complexities of mathematical equations and theories. It was only when the fire began to die down that he became aware of the house again. The wind had grown stronger, howling around the corners of the building, and the fire had burned low, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. He glanced up, frowning. Something was different. The silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. He could hear the wind outside, but inside the house it was too still, as though the air itself had become heavy. Then a sound. It was faint at first, barely more than a soft scratching, but it was enough to pull Malcolm's attention from his work. He sat still, listening. The sound came again, more insistent this time, an odd scuttling noise, like claws scraping against wood. Rats. He shook his head, irritated with himself for being distracted. Of course, the house would have rats. It had been empty for years. He pushed his chair back and stood, moving toward the far wall, where the sound seemed to be coming from. He listened again, but the noise had stopped. Satisfied, he returned to his seat and added another log to the fire. The flames leaped back to life, pushing back the shadows. He tried to return to his work, but his mind kept drifting. The silence felt different now, less peaceful, and more like the calm before a storm. He shook off the feeling, telling himself it was only the unfamiliarity of the place that unsettled him. He had been alone before. He had studied in silence for years. This was no different. But the scratching came again, louder this time, more insistent. He set down his pen, turning his head toward the noise. It was definitely coming from behind the walls now. He could hear the faint rustle of movement, as though something was scurrying just out of sight. Rats, he reminded himself. Just rats. But something about the sound made him uneasy. There was a rhythm to it, a deliberate scratching that seemed too coordinated to be random. He rose from his seat again, this time more agitated, and moved toward the corner of the room where the sound was the loudest. He knelt, pressing his ear against the wall. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was behind the walls had become aware of him. Malcolm stood, his irritation mounting. It was foolish to be so easily unnerved by vermin. Still, the house seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as though the walls themselves had shifted in some imperceptible way. He stoked the fire again, forcing himself to focus on the warmth, on the crackling of the logs. There was nothing here but him and the house. The rats would be dealt with in the morning. For now he had his work, and nothing would distract him. But even as he settled back into his chair, the silence pressed in, thicker and more oppressive than before. The wind howled outside, and the firelight flickered uncertainly, casting shadows that seemed to twist and bend in ways that made his skin crawl, and somewhere behind the walls, the scratching began again. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. A Presence in the House. The scratching persisted through the night, never quite loud enough to fully pull Malcolm from his work, but always present, an incessant reminder that he was not alone. Each time the noise began again, his concentration faltered, and his pen paused mid-sentence. It was becoming intolerable. By the time the clock struck midnight, his patience had worn thin. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold of the room settled in his bones. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the stone floor, and walked to the window. The wind outside had picked up, whistling sharply through the cracks in the walls. The night sky was thick with clouds, dark and heavy, obscuring even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. He turned from the window and surveyed the room. The old portraits on the walls were cloaked in shadow, their features indiscernible, but the oppressive weight of their presence was unmistakable. Malcolm's eyes lingered on one painting in particular, a large, grim depiction of a man seated in a high-backed chair, his eyes hard and piercing, as though he were watching Malcolm from across the room. He dismissed the thought, irritated at his own mind for playing tricks on him. The house was old, neglected. Of course it would creak and groan under the strain of the wind, and of course the walls would be filled with rats. There was nothing unusual about it. He had expected it, but the scratching continued, persistent, unyielding. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled him now, it was the silence that followed. Each time the scratching stopped, the air grew thick, the house unnervingly still, as though it were listening, waiting for him to react. With a sharp exhale of frustration, Malcolm stood up, grabbed the poker from beside the hearth, and walked toward the far wall, where the sound had been most frequent. He tapped the wood with the iron rod, hard enough to echo through the empty space, but there was no response. He pressed his ear against the wall again, listening. The sound had stopped. He straightened, staring at the wall as if daring it to betray its secrets, but all remained silent. Feeling slightly foolish, he returned the poker to its place by the fire and made a mental note to investigate more thoroughly in the morning. Perhaps a few traps would take care of the problem. Back at the table, Malcolm resumed his work, though the atmosphere had grown heavier, the room colder, despite the embers still glowing faintly in the hearth. The flickering shadows in the corners seemed to dance at the edges of his vision, but when he looked directly, they were still. His mind, he assured himself, was simply fatigued from the long day of travel and unfamiliar surroundings. Nothing more. The clock struck 2 before he finally decided to call it a night. His eyes burned from the hours spent reading by lamplight, and his thoughts had become sluggish. Gathering his papers and neatly stacking them on the table, he extinguished the lamp, leaving the fire as the only source of light in the room. As he made his way to the stairs, the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the room in an unnatural darkness. The moment his hand touched the banister, the scratching resumed. This time it was louder, much louder, a frantic, almost panicked sound, as if something trapped inside the walls was clawing desperately to escape. Malcolm froze, his hand tightening on the banister. The noise reverberated through the room, filling the air with an unbearable tension. His heart began to pound, though he was unsure why. They were just rats, after all. Weren't they? Slowly, he turned back to the room, his eyes scanning the dim space, now only illuminated by the dying fire. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very bones of the house itself. It was as if the entire structure was alive with movement. For a moment Malcolm stood motionless, the poker still within reach, listening to the scurrying, the scraping, and the strange rhythm of it all. He forced himself to breathe evenly, though his mind raced with thoughts he couldn't quite suppress. Hadn't Mrs. Witham mentioned something about this house being avoided? The judge's house, she'd called it, as though the name itself carried weight. But those were just stories. Old wives' tales. Superstitions passed down through generations of frightened townsfolk. Malcolm gritted his teeth. This was madness. He was a man of reason, a scholar. He would not be undone by rodents and the creaking of an old house. Ignoring the chill creeping up his spine, he ascended the stairs, determined to ignore the noise and sleep. But as he climbed, the scratching grew louder still, following him up the stairs like a whisper in the dark. The upper floor was colder than the lower, and the hallway stretched out in front of him, narrow and shadowed. The doors to the other rooms remained closed, but as he passed them, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The sensation was subtle at first, but it grew stronger with each step. He quickened his pace, eager to reach his room and the sanctuary of his bed. The large four-poster bed loomed in the center of the room as he entered, and the firelight from downstairs did little to chase away the cold. The bed's velvet curtains hung heavy, and the room felt oppressive, almost claustrophobic. He moved to the window, drawing back the thick curtains to peer outside. The wind had picked up, shaking the bare branches of the trees that lined the yard, but there was no sign of life. He closed the curtains and turned to the bed. The noise had stopped again. The scratching, the scurrying. It was as though the house had settled into an uneasy stillness, holding its breath. Malcolm undressed quickly, eager to get under the thick blankets and away from the gnawing cold. But as soon as he lay down, the mattress creaking beneath his weight, he heard it again. This time the scratching wasn't behind the walls. It was above him, directly above. His breath caught, and he stared up at the ceiling, eyes wide in the darkness. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving just above the beams, scraping against the wood. Slowly, Malcolm sat up, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress. His heart thudded in his chest as he listened. The noise moved, whatever it was. It moved across the ceiling toward the far corner of the room. His eyes followed the sound, and that was when he saw it. The rope, hanging from the ceiling in the far corner of the room, was an old, frayed rope. He hadn't noticed it before. It dangled there, barely visible in the dim light, swaying slightly as though disturbed by the wind. But there was no wind in the room. Malcolm's throat tightened as his eyes locked onto the rope, now swaying more noticeably. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and Malcolm realized with a sickening sense of dread that whatever was making the noise was moving along the rope itself. In the dim light he saw something, a shadow, a form, dart up the length of the rope, disappearing into the darkness above. His breath hitched, his body rigid with shock. He wanted to move, to leap out of bed, to tear open the door and flee, but his limbs refused to obey him. He sat frozen, staring at the rope, waiting, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The room was still. The rope hung motionless once more, as though nothing had happened. Malcolm sat for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. He forced himself to breathe, to think. It was nothing. It was rats, wind, his own overactive mind. He was tired, that was all. Exhaustion playing tricks on him. But he knew better. Somewhere deep inside, a primal part of him that he had long buried knew that what he had just witnessed was no trick of the mind. There was something in the house, and it was watching him. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Echo of the Past. Sleep came to Malcolm in fits and starts, haunted by vivid nightmares that seemed more like fragmented memories than dreams. In his restless slumber, he saw shadows moving along the walls of the house, dark figures lurking in corners, and a cold presence that watched him from the foot of his bed. Each time he awoke, he found himself drenched in sweat, the room colder than it had any right to be. When morning finally broke, it brought no relief. The dull gray light filtered through the thick curtains of his room, but the unease lingered. Every inch of his body felt heavy, as if he had carried the weight of the house with him through the night. He sat up slowly, glancing toward the corner where the rope had hung, but in the daylight it seemed harmless, just an old relic from another time, swaying slightly in a draught he could not feel. He forced himself to his feet and dressed mechanically, his mind already retreating into the familiar safety of his studies. Last night had been a trick of the mind, nothing more. The house was old, it made sounds. And as for the rope, well, he hadn't expected everything to be perfectly normal in a place like this. Descending the stairs, he was greeted by the same stillness that had settled over the house since his arrival. The fire had gone out in the hearth, leaving the room colder than ever. As he moved through the empty hall, the floor creaked beneath his feet, and the distant scratching seemed to echo faintly in his ears, though he could no longer be sure whether it was real or imagined. Breakfast was a quick affair, just bread and tea, but it did little to shake the fog that clung to his mind. As he ate, he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, his gaze drawn toward the shadows that seemed to loom larger in the dim corners of the room. Even the sunlight that managed to pierce through the small windows felt weak, barely making a dent in the thick atmosphere that had settled over the house. When he stepped outside, however, the cold grip of the house loosened. The fresh air cleared his head, if only briefly. He made his way back into town to pick up a few supplies, including rat traps, determined to rid himself of at least one nuisance. Mrs. Witham, the innkeeper, greeted him with a warm smile as he passed through the small lobby of the Good Traveler. The sight of her familiar face, framed by the cheerful fire burning in the hearth, momentarily soothed his nerves. "Good morning, Mr. Malcolmson," she said brightly, though her eyes seemed to study him with a touch of concern. "I hope the house is to your liking?" "It's fine," Malcolm said, though he knew his words lacked conviction. He could feel her watching him, waiting for more. After a pause, he added, "It's quiet, perfect for my work." Mrs. Witham nodded, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her expression. "You don't hear anything strange, do you? You've been sleeping well?" Malcolm felt an irrational irritation rise within him. The last thing he needed was to feed the local superstitions with tales of restless nights and scurrying sounds in the walls. He forced a smile. "It's an old house. There are always sounds, aren't there?" Mrs. Witham looked unconvinced. "Aye, that there are. But you mind yourself. That house—" She trailed off, as if reconsidering her words. "It's just that it's been empty for so long. Strange things happen in places that have been left alone too long, you know." He nodded stiffly, eager to leave her well-meaning concern behind and focus on the tasks at hand. After securing what he needed from the local store, he returned to the judge's house, his arms weighed down with provisions, rat traps, and an extra blanket to fend off the biting cold. The house felt no different than it had when he left, still cold and thick with silence. But there was something more now, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end as he entered. The stillness seemed too purposeful, as though the house were watching him, waiting for something. He busied himself setting the rat traps around the room, muttering to himself as he worked. The traps gave him something to focus on, a task to complete, something tangible in the face of the growing unease. He placed one in the far corner of the dining room, another near the fireplace, and a third under the stairs where the scratching had been the loudest the night before. Satisfied, Malcolm returned to his books, his back turned to the empty room. The fire he had relit crackled softly behind him, its warmth barely cutting through the chill. He bent over his notes, determined to lose himself in his work. But the house had other plans. No sooner had he begun than the sound returned. This time, it wasn't the soft scratching of the night before. It was louder, more deliberate, like something heavy was moving behind the walls. Malcolm stiffened in his chair, his hand gripping his pen tightly. He waited, hoping the noise would stop, that it was merely his mind playing tricks on him. But it continued, persistent and rhythmic, as though something were pacing just beyond the walls. His eyes darted toward the far corner of the room, where the rope had hung the night before. It was swaying again, ever so slightly, despite the absence of wind. It couldn't be. Slowly, Malcolm stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The sound was louder now, a scraping, dragging noise that made his skin crawl. He turned toward the fireplace where the old bell rope dangled and felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The rope was moving again, swaying more violently this time, as though something were climbing it. He swallowed hard, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to stop, to ignore it, to sit down and focus on his work. But his body seemed to move of its own accord, drawn toward the rope with a dreadful fascination. As he approached, he saw it again, a shape darting up the length of the rope, faster than anything he had ever seen. It disappeared into the shadows above, and the scratching ceased. Malcolm stared at the rope, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, but now it carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Something was here. Something that didn't belong. Without thinking, he grabbed the poker from beside the hearth and marched toward the corner where the rope hung. His breath came in quick, sharp bursts as he reached up and grabbed the end of the rope, yanking it down hard. Nothing happened. He stood there, gripping the rope in his fist, his heart racing. But the house remained silent. The shape was gone, if it had ever truly been there. Frustrated and unnerved, Malcolm released the rope and let it fall limply against the wall. He was being ridiculous. This was an old house. Of course there were rats. Of course the wind made things sway. There was no need for this madness. He dropped the poker back into its place and returned to the table, determined to push through the rest of the day. But as he settled back into his chair, the room felt darker, colder. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, creeping across the floor like the fingers of some unseen force. He opened his book, but the words on the page swam before his eyes. All he could think of was the rope and the thing that had climbed it. The noise, the movement, it had been real. He knew it. He had seen it. But what was it? Malcolm forced himself to concentrate, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave the house, to run far from the oppressive weight that hung over him like a storm about to break. The scratching began again, louder this time, closer. And Malcolm knew, whatever it was getting bolder. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Judge. The noise didn't stop that night. It grew louder as the evening deepened, the house creaking and groaning as though it were trying to speak, trying to convey something ancient and terrible that Malcolm could not comprehend. The fire, once a source of comfort, now cast harsh, jagged shadows that seemed to twist and writhe along the walls. Malcolm found it impossible to focus on his studies. The equations and diagrams blurred on the pages of his books, overshadowed by the relentless sound of scratching, scurrying, and movement above and around him. It was nearly midnight when the air grew impossibly cold. Malcolm pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, but the chill cut through it, settling deep into his bones. He sat back in the large chair by the fireplace, his fingers trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea, but the warmth from the cup did nothing to steady his nerves. His eyes were drawn again to the corner of the room, to the bell rope that hung there. It was still now, swaying slightly, but something about its presence unnerved him. He had tried to ignore it, to focus on his work, but the rope felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to notice it, waiting for him to do something. He forced himself to look away, staring instead into the embers of the dying fire. His logical mind knew there was nothing unusual about the rope. It was just an old fixture of the house, a relic of a time long past. But something deep in his gut, something primal, screamed at him to get out, to leave the house behind and never look back. Still, he stayed. The rational part of him refused to give in to such irrational fear. He was a man of reason, a scholar. He would not let his mind be overwhelmed by superstition and shadows. He was here to work, to prepare for his examination. The house, the noises, the darkness, none of it mattered. But the silence that followed the last of the scratching felt different. It wasn't a calm, peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Malcolm stood, unable to sit still any longer. The weight of the house seemed to press down on him, thickening the air, making every breath feel labored. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece, just a few minutes to midnight. The clock ticked softly, the only sound in the room, and its rhythmic ticking seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Then a noise. It wasn't the usual scurrying of the rats. It wasn't the wind rattling the shutters. This sound was different. It was a soft, low creak like wood bending under pressure. Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. The sound was coming from the corner of the room. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned his head toward the bell rope. The rope was moving again. This time it wasn't a gentle sway. It was jerking slightly, as though someone were pulling it from above. Malcolm stared, frozen in place, his breath shallow. His rational mind fought to come up with an explanation, but none would stick. The rope gave another sharp jerk, and a strange, low groan echoed through the house, as if the very walls were protesting. The room seemed to darken further, the shadows deepening until they were almost alive, swirling in the corners like smoke. He took a step toward the rope, his feet moving almost of their own accord. The closer he got, the colder the room became, until his breath fogged in the air before him. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, loud and fast, as he reached out, his fingers trembling, to touch the rope. The moment his hand brushed the frayed cord, the air changed. It was as if the house exhaled, and with that breath came a sudden, overwhelming presence. The air was thick with it, ancient, powerful, filled with an unnameable malice that wrapped around him like a vice. Malcolm stumbled back, his heart racing, as the rope gave another violent jerk, and then, from the shadows, a figure began to emerge. It was barely more than a silhouette at first, a vague shape outlined in the dim light of the dying fire. But as it moved closer, stepping into the room, its form became clearer. It was a man, or at least it had been once. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned robes that seemed to billow around him like smoke. His face was pale, gaunt, with sharp features that seemed to have been carved from stone. His eyes were the worst of it, cold, cruel, burning with a dark fire that sent a shiver down Malcolm's spine. The man, or whatever he was, stared at Malcolm with an intensity that made his skin crawl, his expression one of cold, calculated malice. Malcolm's mouth went dry. He wanted to speak, to demand what this apparition was, but the words died in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He could only watch in horror as the figure stepped forward, his cold eyes never leaving Malcolm's. "The judge," Malcolm whispered, the words escaping him before he even realized he'd spoken. The figure smiled, an awful twisted smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Indeed," the judge said, his voice low, like the creak of ancient wood. "You've heard of me, then?" Malcolm's legs threatened to give out beneath him. He stumbled backward, his hand clutching the back of the chair for support. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. I don't believe in ghosts," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The judge chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver through Malcolm's entire body. "Ghosts?" the judge said, taking another step closer. "Is that what you think I am? A mere shadow of a man long dead?" The room seemed to pulse with an energy that Malcolm couldn't describe, a feeling of dread that clung to him like a second skin. "I am no ghost, Malcolmson. I am justice. I am retribution. And this house is my domain." Malcolm's breath came in short, sharp gasps. He tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The judge was too close now, his presence filling the room, suffocating Malcolm with the weight of his gaze. "You thought you could hide here, boy?" the judge hissed, his voice like the scraping of iron against stone. "Thought you could escape the world, escape judgment?" Malcolm shook his head, unable to form words. "There is no escape from justice," the judge said, his voice growing colder, harsher. "There is only the sentence." The judge raised one hand, and Malcolm's eyes were drawn to the rope, now swinging violently, as if pulled by invisible hands. The scratching sound began again, louder this time, echoing through the house like the rattling of chains. The rope twisted and coiled like a snake, rising toward the ceiling, and Malcolm's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. The rope was forming a noose. "No," Malcolm whispered, his voice shaking. "Raph, this isn't real. This can't be real." The judge's smile widened. "Reality is not for you to decide. Your judgment has already been passed." Malcolm felt the cold hand of terror tighten around his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The noose was coming closer, swinging in the air as though it had a life of its own, its frayed edges brushing against his skin. The judge stepped back, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction as the rope coiled around Malcolm's neck, tightening with every second. And then with one final tug, the world went dark. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Weight of Darkness. Malcolm awoke with a jolt, his body drenched in sweat, gasping for air as though he had been suffocating. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The darkness around him felt suffocating, the air thick with a stifling weight. His chest heaved as he forced himself to breathe, his fingers clutching at the bedclothes beneath him. It took several long seconds for him to remember. The judge's house, the bell rope, the figure. He bolted upright, his eyes wide as they darted around the room. It was dark, though not entirely. The pale, gray light of the early morning was just beginning to creep through the narrow windows, casting weak, uneven shadows on the walls. But there was nothing else, no figure looming in the shadows, no cold presence watching him from the corner. The house was silent again. He reached up instinctively, touching his neck. His skin was cold, damp from sweat, but there was no sign of the noose he had felt in his dream, or what he desperately hoped had been a dream. Malcolm threw the blankets aside and stood up shakily. His legs were weak, his body trembling as though he had been running for miles. His mind, still fogged from the remnants of the nightmare, raced to make sense of what had happened. It had to have been a dream. The judge, the rope, the feeling of the noose tightening around his neck. It wasn't possible. But it had felt so real. He glanced toward the corner of the room where the bell rope still hung, swaying gently as though it had never moved in the night. His heart thudded in his chest, a deep unease settling in his stomach. The events of the night were already blurring in his memory, slipping away like sand through his fingers. Had it been real? Or had it been a trick of his exhausted, overstimulated mind? Malcolm ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to shake the feeling. He needed clarity. He needed to regain control over his thoughts. The house was old, and his imagination had gotten the better of him. The figure of the judge, the tightening noose, it was all a result of his growing isolation and fatigue. The scratching noises, the swaying rope, the cold presence, it was the natural sounds and movements of an ancient house settling in the night. That's what he told himself. But a part of him, the part still shivering from the memory, remained unconvinced. By the time he dressed and made his way downstairs, the morning light had strengthened, though it did little to chase away the chill that lingered in the house. His body was still heavy with fatigue, but his mind felt clearer now, sharper. As he prepared his breakfast in the silent kitchen, he tried to focus on his studies, to shift his thoughts back to the work that had brought him here in the first place. But the house had other plans. The moment he set his cup down on the table, the scratching returned. This time it was louder, more aggressive. Malcolm stiffened, his eyes darting to the walls, then to the ceiling. The noise was unmistakable now, a scraping, scurrying sound that seemed to come from all around him. He stood up, his heart racing, and followed the sound to the main hallway. It was as though the walls themselves were alive with movement. He stopped in front of the staircase, where the noise was the loudest. He listened, breath held as the scratching intensified, echoing through the hallway like claws scraping against the wood. Rats, he told himself, they're just rats. But the sound, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was as if something far larger than a rat was moving behind the walls, something with purpose. His skin prickled with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. The memory of the judge's appearance in the night loomed large in his mind, threatening to break through the fragile wall of rationality he had built around himself. But he couldn't afford to give in to such fears. Not now. Not when he was so close to finishing his work. Determined to maintain control, Malcolm grabbed the poker from beside the hearth and headed toward the stairs. His hand gripped the cold iron rod tightly as he ascended, one step at a time, the wooden boards creaking beneath his feet. The noise above him grew louder with each step, as though whatever was behind the walls knew he was coming. At the top of the stairs, Malcolm stopped, the air colder than it had been downstairs. The narrow corridor stretched out before him, lined with closed doors. The scratching was louder here, almost deafening, and he could hear something else now, too, a low, rhythmic thudding, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor above him. He moved slowly down the hallway, his breath visible in the freezing air. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to keep moving. One of the doors stood slightly ajar, and the noise seemed to be coming from behind it, the door to the attic. Malcolm hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The sound was relentless now, a steady, dragging noise punctuated by sharp, scratching claws. His grip tightened on the poker, his pulse racing, as he steeled himself to open the door. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, revealing a dark staircase leading up into the attic. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. The air was thick with cold, more biting than anywhere else in the house, and Malcolm could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him from above. He swallowed hard and took a step forward, his foot landing on the first creaking stair. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, alive, shifting with the faintest movement of the air. His breath quickened, but he forced himself up the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. At the top, the attic was even darker than he had expected. The small window was so caked with grime that no light filtered through, and the room was filled with old, broken furniture, forgotten trunks, and layers of dust so thick they seemed undisturbed for years. Malcolm stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the darkness. The air was still, but he could feel something watching him, waiting. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the attic, beneath the shadows of the old rafters, hung a figure. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shape, a bundle of rags swaying gently in the draft. But as Malcolm's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw the outline of a man's form, suspended from the ceiling by a thick rope. The rope. It was the same rope that hung in the dining room, only now it was tied into a perfect noose, wrapped tightly around the figure's neck. The man's head lolled to one side, his body limp, as though he had been hanging there for decades. Malcolm's heart slammed against his ribs. His legs threatened to give out beneath him, but he stood frozen, staring at the figure. And then, slowly, impossibly, the figure began to move. The head lifted, the neck cracking with the sound of old wood snapping, and the dead man's eyes opened, cold, empty, and filled with malice. His lips parted, forming a twisted, unnatural smile, as the rope creaked and groaned with the weight of his body. The judge. Malcolm stumbled back, his throat dry, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet refused to move. The judge's eyes locked onto his, gleaming with a cold, malevolent light. "You thought you could escape justice, boy?" the judge whispered, his voice like the scraping of iron across stone. The rope tightened, pulling the judge's body upward, his form swinging slowly back and forth like a pendulum. Malcolm felt the walls of the attic closing in on him, the air growing thicker with each breath, the cold seeping into his bones. "There is no escape," the judge hissed, his voice filling the room, echoing in the rafters. "Not for you. Not for anyone." Malcolm's body trembled with fear, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. He had to get out. He had to leave this cursed house, this place of death and judgment. But as he turned to flee, the attic door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in with the judge. The last thing he heard was the sound of the rope creaking, the noose tightening, and the judge's cruel laughter filling the room. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Weight of Judgment. Malcolm stood frozen before the closed attic door, his heart hammering in his chest, each beat louder than the last. His mind raced, torn between disbelief and the overwhelming terror that clawed at his throat. The judge's cold, twisted smile lingered in his thoughts, the echo of that ghastly laugh reverberating in the thick, oppressive air. This isn't real. This can't be real, he thought, but the icy terror coursing through him told him otherwise. He turned back toward the figure that hung in the shadows, the heavy noose creaking under the weight of its form. The judge's dead eyes were locked on him, and the room felt as though it had been pulled into some twisted version of time. a place where the past, present, and future bled into one another. The attic, once filled with dust and forgotten relics, now seemed alive with the weight of unseen forces, as if the very house was reacting to the presence of the figure, to the history embedded in its walls. The judge's eyes followed Malcolm's every movement, gleaming with a cold, malicious awareness that turned Malcolm's blood to ice. He took a step back, his hand fumbling for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The wood was unyielding, as if the door itself had fused with the wall. He yanked harder, panic rising in his chest, but it remained shut, as though the house had trapped him within its twisted embrace. The judge's body swayed slightly, the rope creaking with each movement, and Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. There was no escaping this. He was trapped in a nightmare far worse than anything he could have imagined. The figure before him was not just a phantom, not a mere ghost born of fevered dreams. It was a force, a presence that was as real as the walls around him, and it demanded something from him. Malcolm pressed himself against the door, his mind struggling to make sense of the impossible. The judge's cold eyes seemed to pierce through him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rasping, like ancient wood splintering in the wind. "You seek reason in a place where none exists," the judge said, his voice sending a shiver down Malcolm's spine. "You have entered my house, and now you stand before my court, and in my court there is no room for reason. Only judgment." "I did nothing wrong," Malcolm whispered, his voice shaking. He wasn't even sure why he spoke, why he felt the need to defend himself against this spectral figure. "I'm just a scholar, a man of study. I came here to work. I don't believe in—" "Belief is irrelevant," the judge's mouth twisted into a cruel sneer. "You stand in the place of the condemned. The innocent and the guilty alike have come before me, but here all face the same reckoning." Malcolm's throat tightened as the judge's words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could take. His mind, once sharp and focused, now teetered on the edge of collapse. The judge's presence, the overwhelming darkness of the attic, the sound of the noose swinging, it was all too much. "What do you want from me?" Malcolm asked, his voice cracking. His hands trembled as he took another step back, his body pressed hard against the door that refused to yield. The judge's eyes gleamed with something darker than malice, something ancient, something powerful. "I want what was always mine," he said softly, his voice as cold as the grave. "Justice." The word lingered in the air, heavy with finality. Malcolm felt his pulse quicken, his body growing cold as he stared into the abyss that was the judge's gaze. Justice. The word hung over him like a sword waiting to fall. But what justice? Malcolm had done nothing wrong. He had committed no crime, had passed no sentence. He was a scholar, a man devoted to his studies, to the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. What could the judge want from him? The scratching sound returned, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It came from the walls, from the floor, from all around him, as though the house itself had come alive, filled with the scurrying of unseen creatures. "Justice is inescapable," the judge continued, his voice filling the room, drowning out the scratching noise. "Those who come to my house are judged, whether they know it or not, and those who do not face judgment themselves become the instruments of it." Malcolm shook his head, backing further into the door, his heart racing. "I don't understand." The judge's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with cruel delight. "You will." The rope swung suddenly, violently, and Malcolm's body tensed as he watched the judge rise higher into the air, the noose tightening around his neck. The figure swayed above him, a grotesque puppet suspended by the will of the house itself. And then the attic shifted. The shadows deepened, the air thickened, and the scratching grew louder, louder than ever before. It was coming from everywhere, filling the room with an unbearable, high-pitched cacophony. The walls seemed to pulse and bend, the floor beneath him felt unstable, as if the entire house was groaning under the weight of some unimaginable force. Malcolm's breath hitched as he felt the floor give way beneath him. For a moment, his world tilted, and then he was falling. The darkness swallowed him whole. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs, and for a brief, disorienting moment, everything was still. The world spun, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had happened. He lay there, gasping for air, the cold stone floor pressing into his back. When he opened his eyes, the attic was gone. He was lying in the grand dining room, the fire in the hearth long extinguished, the room drenched in shadow. His body ached, his limbs stiff and cold, as if he had been lying there for hours, perhaps even days. He sat up slowly, his head spinning, and tried to gather his thoughts. The judge, the attic, the noose, was it real? He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the rope that still hung from the corner near the fireplace. It was still swaying gently in the cold draft that swept through the house. For a moment he allowed himself to hope that it had been nothing more than a dream, a figment of his exhausted mind, pushed to the edge by isolation and fear. But then the rope began to move. It swung slowly, deliberately, as though something was tugging at it from above. The scratching returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls like a living thing. And from the shadows a figure emerged. The judge was back, his cold, dead eyes fixed on Malcolm as he stepped forward, his body no longer suspended, but walking slowly, deliberately, toward him. "There is no escape from justice," the judge whispered, his voice low and haunting. "You have been judged, Malcolmson." The room grew darker, the shadows closing in on him, and Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, backing away from the advancing figure, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. The judge was real, and he was here, in this house, in this room, demanding retribution. The rope swung violently now, the noose forming once more, ready to claim its victim. Malcolm's vision blurred, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out, but there was none. The judge was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around him, it all belonged to the judge. And as the noose tightened around his neck, the last thing Malcolm heard was the judge's voice, cold and final. "Justice has been served." End of chapter 7. Epilogue. The silence after. The morning in Benchurch dawned quiet and still, as it always did, with the low sun casting long, pale shadows over the market square. A few early risers were out, going about their daily routines, exchanging pleasantries over bread and milk. The ordinary hum of life continued, but an undercurrent of unease had settled over the town in recent days. Mrs. Witham had been uneasy all morning. It wasn't just the way the wind had howled through the night, or the sharp, cold snap that had come out of nowhere. No, it was something else. A nagging feeling, a gnawing sense that something wasn't quite right. She hadn't seen young Mr. Malcolmson in days, too long, she thought. The lad had seemed determined to shut himself away, wrapped up in his books, but still, she would have expected him to pop into the inn for supplies, or perhaps just to exchange a few words. His polite but distant manner had unsettled her when he first arrived. Now his silence disturbed her even more. By mid-morning, the sense of dread had grown too much to ignore. Mrs. Witham gathered her shawl tightly around her shoulders and set off toward the judge's house. The closer she got, the more oppressive the air became. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place, the usual morning chatter eerily absent as she approached the gate. The house stood just as it always had, dark, looming, and silent, the windows staring out like vacant eyes. She hesitated before knocking on the heavy oak door. The sense of wrongness was palpable now, crawling under her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. But she knocked, and when no response came, she knocked again. Still nothing. "Mr. Malcolmson?" she called, her voice swallowed by the thick silence. She tried the door. It creaked open with a reluctant groan. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been for a house closed against the elements. Mrs. Witham stepped cautiously into the entryway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the small, grimy windows. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, and the house seemed frozen in a timeless stillness. "Mr. Malcolmson?" she called again, louder this time, though she already knew no answer would come. She moved further into the house, her footsteps echoing eerily in the empty rooms. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way into the grand dining room, the very room where she had last seen Malcolmson, setting up his papers and books by the fire. And then she saw it. Hanging from the bell rope in the far corner of the room was Malcolm's lifeless body, the noose wrapped tightly around his neck, his face pale and twisted in horror. His eyes, once sharp and full of purpose, were wide open, staring blankly into the void. The chair he had been sitting in was overturned, and his books lay scattered across the floor. Mrs. Witham let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment she could do nothing but stare, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The house felt alive with silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides, as though the very walls were watching, waiting. She could feel it deep in her bones. This place, the judge's house, it had claimed another victim. She fled the house, her heart pounding in her chest as she ran back toward the town, her breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time she reached the village square, her panic had drawn a small crowd. The constable was summoned, and soon enough, a group of townsfolk gathered, hesitant but grim-faced, ready to investigate what Mrs. Witham had discovered. When they entered the house, the scene was exactly as she had described, Malcolmson hanging from the bell rope, his body swaying gently in the draught. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of violence, only the eerie quiet of the house and the unmistakable weight of something ancient and terrible that lingered in the air. The constable inspected the room, his brow furrowed, but there was little to explain what had happened. No one spoke aloud of the old stories, of the judge who had once lived in the house and his reputation for cruel, unforgiving sentences. No one dared mention the tales of those who had ventured too close to the house and never returned. But everyone felt it, the unspoken truth that this house was more than just stone and wood. It carried something darker, something that reached beyond the grave. As they cut Malcolm's body down from the rope, the bell in the judge's house gave one last, mournful toll, echoing through the town like a warning. The townsfolk stood in silence, their faces pale, their eyes cast downward. They had seen enough. They knew better than to linger. By the afternoon, the door to the judge's house was locked and bolted, its windows shuttered. No one spoke of the tragedy again, and the house remained empty, just as it had been before. The locals, as always, kept their distance, avoiding the place as though it were cursed, whispering among themselves that the house should have been left alone. And so the judge's house returned to its stillness, to its waiting. The stories would fade, as they always did, into rumor and forgotten tales, and one day someone else, perhaps another scholar, another seeker of solitude, would find their way to the house. And when they did, the judge would be waiting, his rope ready to deliver his final judgment once again. End of epilogue. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this retelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss new stories. We bring classic plays, fairy tales, and timeless stories to life with a fresh twist. And if you know someone who'd enjoy these reimagined tales, please share the channel with them. Your support helps us continue to grow and bring more stories to you.